The Golden Twenties ruined these investors. And the terrifying part, they never saw it coming. These were not foolish people. They were not gamblers. They were not reckless. They were careful. They were disciplined. They had already survived one of the worst financial disasters in human history. And then, the good times came back. The cities were rebuilt. The music was playing. The money was flowing. And that was exactly when the trap was set. Stay right there, because what happened next changed everything. Welcome to Dominance Aura, the channel where history does not simply tell stories, it delivers warnings. Now, before we go any further, a small request. If you are watching this right now, and you have been following this channel for some time, do something for us today. Hit that subscribe button. Think of it like this. You know that wise old gentleman in the neighborhood, the one who has seen everything, lived through everything, and never gives advice unless it truly matters? This channel is that gentleman, and subscribing is simply how you make sure you never miss when he speaks, so go ahead, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it may save you years of regret. Also, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from today? We read every single one. The year was 1924. Germany had just survived something almost impossible to describe. A financial catastrophe so severe, so total, that ordinary people had carried their savings to the market in wheelbarrows. Not because they were wealthy, but because the paper money had become so worthless, it weighed more than it was worth. Businesses had collapsed. Life savings had vanished overnight. Families who had worked and saved for decades found themselves with nothing. And then, suddenly, it stopped. In November 1923, Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. And almost like a miracle, the hyperinflation ended. The country exhaled. People who had lived in pure financial terror for years finally felt something they had almost forgotten. Hope. And hope, as history would prove, was the most dangerous thing they could have felt. By 1924, a new plan was already in motion. It was called the Dawes Plan, named after an American banker from Chicago named Charles Dawes. The idea was straightforward. American banks would lend enormous sums of money to Germany. Germany would use that money to rebuild, and the world would move forward. J.P. Morgan arranged the first loan, 800 million Reichsmarks, at 7% interest. American banks did not stop there. They competed aggressively to lend even more. Thomas Lamont of Morgan later described the scene with words that should have been a warning in themselves. He spoke of a horde of American bankers sitting on doorsteps, offering money. When bankers are sitting on doorsteps offering money, something is always wrong. But in 1924, nobody wanted to hear that. Between 1924 and 1930, Germany absorbed 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans. American capital alone accounted for 70% of Germany's total capital imports by 1928. The results were visible. They were real. They were impressive. National income rose 25% between 1925 and 1928. Industrial output doubled. German stocks rose 163% in real terms over just 17 months. Banks were paying interest again. Real estate was appreciating. The restaurants were full. The theaters were open. Germany looked alive again. And for the investors and businessmen sitting quietly on the sidelines, holding gold coins that earned nothing, watching this rebuilt world around them, they looked like the most boring people in the room. That feeling, that quiet, nagging pressure, there's a particular kind of danger that does not arrive with warning signs. It does not come dressed in darkness. It comes dressed in prosperity. It comes with good news, rising numbers, and the sound of a city rebuilding itself around you. And in Germany, between 1925 and 1928, that danger had a very convincing costume. Consider the position of a man who had done everything right. He had watched the hyperinflation destroy his neighbors. He had held his gold coins quietly, patiently, while paper money turned to dust around him. He had survived something that financially annihilated 12% of the German population. He was disciplined. He was careful. He was proven correct. And now, he was watching German stocks rise 163% in 17 months. He was watching his neighbor, who had invested in the stock market, buy a new automobile. He was watching real estate appreciate. He was watching bank deposits pay interest. He was watching a country that had been on its knees stand up, straighten its collar, and walk confidently into the future. And every single morning, he looked at his gold coins, and they looked exactly the same as the day before. No growth, no return, no reward, just preservation. And preservation, when everything around you is growing, feels remarkably like losing. This was the psychological machinery of the trap. It did not need to lie to its victims. It simply needed to show them real evidence, long enough, consistently enough, until the weight of that evidence became unbearable. Sebastian Haffner, The German journalist who lived through every single year of this period described the Stresemann years with extraordinary precision. There was an ample measure of freedom, peace, and order, he wrote. Everyone was cordially invited to concentrate on their personal lives. That sentence deserves to be read twice. Everyone was cordially invited to concentrate on their personal lives. Translation, stop worrying. The crisis is behind you. The system is working. Trust it again. And one by one, they did. The businessman who had kept foreign currency hidden at home quietly moved it into a German bank account to earn interest. The investor, who had held physical gold through the worst years, converted a portion into German stocks. Because the evidence suggested the economy was genuinely recovering, the careful man, the disciplined man, the man who had been proven right once, began to believe that being right once meant the danger had permanently passed. But beneath the surface of this remarkable prosperity, a structural problem was quietly growing. 55% of all capital flowing into Germany during this period was short-term, not long-term investment, not permanent capital committed to German industry and German futures. Short-term loans, callable at any time, by anyone, for any reason. The entire German economic recovery, the rising stocks, the appreciating real estate, the paying bank deposits, was built on a foundation that could be removed with a single phone call. And in late 1928, a full year before Wall Street would make its famous collapse, the phone rang. American capital began withdrawing from Germany quietly at first, then with increasing urgency. The investors who had finally capitulated, who had finally trusted the system again, who had finally stopped feeling like the most boring people in the room, did not yet understand what that phone call meant. They would. Within 3 years, they would understand completely. There is a moment in every financial collapse that historians can identify with precision, not the moment the newspapers reported it. Not the moment the politicians addressed it, the moment before all of that, when the structure that everyone had trusted, quietly and without announcement, began to break. In Germany, that moment arrived in the spring of 1931, and it did not arrive loudly. It began in Austria, May 1931. A bank called Credit Anstalt, one of the most respected financial institutions in Central Europe, announced that it could not meet its commitments. Credit Anstalt controlled more than half of Austria's entire banking balance sheet. When it fell, it did not fall alone. Financial contagion, unlike disease, does not respect borders. It does not pause at checkpoints. It does not require a passport. It simply moves. And within weeks, it had moved directly into Germany. July 13th, 1931, a date that does not appear in most history books, a date that should. On that morning, Danat Bank, one of Germany's most prominent commercial banks, disclosed publicly that it could not meet its commitments. The announcement landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved instantly. Dresdner Bank followed, then another, then another. Within days, 4 of Germany's 5 leading commercial banks had been placed under government control. The government did the only thing governments do when the banking system collapses beneath them. They declared a bank holiday. The doors closed, and the people who had trusted the system, who had moved their savings back inside the institution, who had converted their gold and their foreign currency into German bank deposits to earn interest, stood outside those closed doors and waited. Most of them would wait forever. Now consider what the forensic record shows, asset class by asset class, because this is not a story. This is a documented sequence of destruction. German stocks, the same stocks that had risen 163% in 17 months during the golden years, collapsed with a totality that erased everything. The investors who had watched those stocks rise through 1925, 1926, 1927, and had finally entered the market in the later years, watched their entire position destroyed. Not reduced, not damaged, destroyed. Bank deposits, the accounts that had been paying interest, the accounts that had convinced disciplined savers to trust the system again, were frozen. And when the banks that held them failed, the deposits did not return. German government bonds, corporate debt, the instruments that had been repackaged and sold as stable, reliable, safe, were devastated by the deflationary spiral that followed the collapse. Real estate, the property that had appreciated so convincingly through the boom years, faced accelerating foreclosures as unemployment climbed above 30% by early 1932. 30%. 3 out of every 10 working Germans had no income. And the men who owned real estate with debt attached to it discovered that debt does not disappear when the economy does. But the forensic record does not only document destruction, it documents survival. And the pattern of survival is precise enough to be uncomfortable. Physical gold, held outside the banking system, increased its purchasing power by approximately 20 to 25% during 1929 to 1932. not because gold rose dramatically in nominal terms, but because prices fell sharply around it while gold held its position. In a deflationary collapse, gold does not chase value upward. Value falls toward gold. Physical foreign currency, dollars, Swiss francs, British pounds, held at home rather than deposited in a bank account, maintained full purchasing power. The mechanism was identical to the hyperinflation years. Assets outside the institution survived. Assets inside did not. Productive land, held without debt, by farmers who could feed themselves without a functioning credit system, did not make those families wealthy by 1932, but it kept them above a floor. And in 1932, Germany, a floor, was everything. Historian Erna Pustow, whose documented interviews capture the human texture of this period with remarkable clarity, described how ordinary Germans arrived at the same conclusion through different paths. The most important distinction they discovered was not which currency they held, it was not which asset class they had chosen, it was one single question. Is what I own inside the institution or outside it? The institution can freeze what it can see. It cannot reach what it cannot find. And so by the end of 1932, the forensic record had delivered its verdict. The Golden Twenties, that remarkable, convincing, beautifully constructed period of prosperity, had done something the hyperinflation itself could not fully accomplish. It had reached into the pockets of the most disciplined investors in Germany, the ones who had survived the worst, the ones who had been proven right once, and it had convinced them to step back inside. The reckoning did not punish the reckless alone. It punished the converted. By 1932, the counting was done. Not the counting of numbers, but the counting of people. The ones who remained standing and the ones who did not. And when historians sat down with the forensic record, when they traced every asset class, every decision, every moment of capitulation, one conclusion emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The people who survived did not survive because they were smarter. They survived because they understood the difference between two words that most investors use interchangeably, but which mean entirely different things: preservation and profit. Here is what the forensic record shows with absolute precision. The German investor who held physical gold coins from 1921 to 1932 survived the hyperinflation that destroyed 12% of the population, survived the Aufwertung, the revaluation law that gave savings holders back 2.5 cents on every dollar they had trusted to the system, survived the Golden Twenties, that beautifully constructed illusion of permanent recovery, without capitulating, survived the banking collapse of 1931 that froze and eliminated deposits across the country, survived the Great Depression that erased stocks, bonds, leveraged real estate, and the financial futures of millions. And at the end of that entire decade, that extraordinary, brutal, unrelenting decade, they were whole, not wealthy, not rewarded with extraordinary returns, not sitting on windfall profits, simply whole. And here's the question that forensic record forces every serious decision maker to sit with. In a decade that financially destroyed the majority of an entire nation, was being whole a consolation prize? Or was it the only prize that existed? Because here is what the record also shows. The American experience offered something different. When President Franklin Roosevelt revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 in January 1934, American gold holders received a 69% nominal gain. The German government offered its gold holders no such bonus, no revaluation windfall, no government reward for discipline. The Reich maintained nominal gold par, even after suspending free convertibility. The reward for an entire decade of discipline, for refusing to capitulate during the most convincing boom Germany had ever seen, was simply this: you were the only person in the room who was not financially destroyed. Now consider the modern parallel, because the forensic record does not stay in 1932. It walks forward. Central banks around the world have purchased more than 3,200 tons of gold in the last 3 years alone. In 2022, net central bank gold purchases hit 1,136 tons, the highest level recorded since the 1950s. Poland, the country that lived through hyperinflation in 1923, is now the world's most aggressive gold buyer, targeting 20% of its total reserves in physical metal. These are not the actions of institutions confident in the permanent stability of paper currency. These are the actions of institutions that have studied the forensic record and are preparing quietly for an Aufwertung decision, a moment when a government must choose whether to restore the purchasing power of savers or inflate its way out of an impossible debt burden. The forensic record from 1925 tells every serious analyst Which choice governments make when the pressure becomes unbearable. The United States' gross national debt passed $38 trillion in early 2026. Annual interest costs surpassed $1.2 trillion, more than Medicare, more than national defense, nearly tripled from where they stood just 5 years earlier. These are not arguments. These are not opinions. These are the same table that existed in Germany before the verdict, simply expressed in current figures. And so the forensic lesson, the one the full decade from 1921 to 1932 delivers to every entrepreneur, every business builder, every serious decision maker watching this today, is not simply hold gold. It is something more precise than that. It is this: understand what you own and why you own it before you need to know. Because the Golden Twenties did not destroy investors with bad information. It destroyed them with good information, delivered at exactly the right moment to produce exactly the wrong decision. The stocks were genuinely rising. The economy was genuinely growing. The prosperity was genuinely real. And that was precisely what made it so devastatingly effective. Hugo Stinnes, the inflation king, had been right about hard assets. He had been catastrophically wrong about leverage. His sons discovered that the distance between those two mistakes was large enough to bury an entire empire. The investors who survived the full decade were not the ones who predicted every crisis correctly. They were the ones who never confused a boom with a recovery. They were the ones who understood that an asset whose purpose is not to grow in good times, but to survive bad ones, is not a boring asset. It is the only asset that was still standing when the counting was done. This has been Dominance Aura. If this forensic breakdown gave you a new lens through which to read what is happening around you today, then this channel has done its job. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this video with someone who still believes that the good times will last forever, and drop a comment below telling us what you want us to examine next, because history is not finished delivering its warnings, and neither are we.